We all know Thomas, right? We call him Doubting Thomas. What we may not realize is that all the disciples at one time or another on their journey to discover that Jesus came back from the dead also doubted. In Matthew, after he had shown himself a few times to his followers and he was ascending into heaven, Matthew records that as they saw him, some still doubted. So let's start off with this question. What does God think of doubt? What does God think of your doubts? And we are going to look at one of my favorite Old Testament characters by the name of Gideon. And you can read all about him in Judges 6-7 because Gideon is great. And we discover in God's interaction with Gideon 3 things of what God thinks and what he thinks about our doubt. So here's the first thing that we discover. First of all, we learn that God can handle our questions. And we see that with Gideon and the fleece, right? He puts out a fleece, he has all these questions, right? God, is that really you? So he puts out the fleece. If it's wet and the ground is dry, it's you, God. It is. Well, he still has questions. He wants it to be reversed. He wants the next morning the fleece to be dry and the ground to be wet. How does God respond to Gideon's questions? Does he say, Gideon, you get one and that's it? No. We see the grace and the mercy of God and the patience of God in his interaction with Gideon. God can handle our questions. If you need other examples of that, check out the Psalms. Wow. God handles the questions of the psalmist over and over again. God can handle your questions that you have about why, about how long, about is this really true? He can handle those questions. Well, what about our feelings? That's the second thing we discover in Gideon's life, in God's interaction with Gideon, is that God can handle our feelings. So Gideon now takes an army to attack the enemy, the Midianites, who have conquered the land. Starts with 30,000. God brings it down to 300. Gideon is nervous. He's anxious on the eve of battle. God orchestrates events so he overhears a dream that God had given the Midianites. And they're scared because they are convinced that Gideon is going to win the battle over the Midianites. God in his graciousness, even though Gideon was afraid on the eve of battle, he was scared. He had anxious thoughts. How did God respond to those feelings? Does he ignore them? Does he pretend that they're not there in Gideon's heart and mind? No. God presses in and provides Gideon exactly what he needs so that Gideon will have courage on the day of battle. This is what God does for us. He can not only handle our questions, he can handle those feelings, those emotions you have of doubt and anxiety and fear. God can handle those. Bring those to God. Thirdly, and this is the great news, right? We see that God can also, besides handling questions, handling our feelings, that God is greater than your doubts. So he's greater than your questions, he's greater than your feelings, he's greater than your doubts. Gideon and his 300 men defeated the Midianites. A couple of thousand years later, Jesus would have a band of followers, and they would be deserting him, leaving him completely alone to face the enemies of sin and death and evil. And Jesus entered that battle by himself, never doubting, never wavering, always saying, not my will, but your will be done. Always being faithful. And in his faithfulness, he was victorious over sin and death and doubt. His victory now, as we put our trust in him, is our victory. So God can handle your questions, he can handle your feelings, and he is greater than your doubt. This is where our eyes need to be directed towards, is in Jesus, who was truly the faithful one and truly stronger than the doubts, than the thoughts, than the feelings that we have. So keep this in mind. God can handle your questions, ask him. God can handle your feelings, be honest with him. And thirdly, never forget that God is greater than your doubts.